Welcome to another episode of True Crime Story Vault. In today's chilling story, we explore a case of ambition, envy, and deceit that unfolded in the quiet town of Cedar Springs, Arkansas. A tale of two colleagues whose bond turned deadly, leading to one of the most shocking murders the town had ever witnessed. Secrets hidden beneath the surface will unravel in ways you won't expect, and the shocking twist at the end will leave you questioning how well you truly know the people closest to you. It was the summer of 1997 in Cedar Springs, Arkansas, a town where everyone's lives intertwined in ways both subtle and profound. Nestled at the heart of this close-knit community was Harrison Watts, a small but respected legal firm that handled the town's most important cases. Inside the walls of that firm worked two of its brightest stars, Eleanor Mitchell and David Carter, two attorneys whose futures seemed destined for greatness. Eleanor Mitchell, 34, had always been the kind of person who thrived on hard work and intellectual rigor. Her sharp mind and laser-focused ambition had carried her far in her career, and at Harrison Watts, she had risen to a position of considerable influence. People in Cedar Springs knew Eleanor as the firm's backbone. She could dismantle a case in court with surgical precision, her words as cutting as they were convincing. Her reputation for being meticulous, prepared, and unsparingly direct earned her respect from clients and colleagues alike. David Carter, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of Eleanor in many ways. He was charismatic, charming, and carried himself with an effortless confidence that made him popular with nearly everyone he met. At 36, he had a presence that filled any room he entered. With his easygoing nature and natural wit, David was the type of person who never seemed to need to try too hard. Things just happened for him. He had an almost uncanny ability to win people over, whether it was the jury in a courtroom or the staff at the office. Despite their differences, Eleanor and David had formed a strong professional bond over the years. They had worked on countless cases together, often burning the midnight oil in the firm's dimly lit offices, where the air smelled of old books and freshly brewed coffee. These late-night work sessions had forged a unique connection between them, one built on mutual respect, even if it wasn't always voiced. Eleanor admired David's ability to think on his feet and charm a jury with ease, but there was always a quiet resentment that she couldn't shake. For all her tireless effort and preparation, it was David's charisma that seemed to win the day in the courtroom. David, for his part, appreciated Eleanor's intellect and determination. She was the one who caught the details others missed, the one who could dissect a legal argument until it was airtight. But David also took her for granted. He assumed Eleanor would always be there, always the dependable partner ready to put in the long hours and do the heavy lifting while he enjoyed the spotlight. To him, the firm was just a stepping stone in his career, a place to build his reputation before moving on to bigger and better things. For Eleanor, however, the firm was everything. It was the place where she had staked her future, her identity, and her self-worth. As the summer months drifted by, the cracks in their partnership began to widen. Eleanor's growing ambition became harder to ignore. She had invested years of her life into Harrison Watts and wanted to be seen as an equal partner, someone whose contributions were recognized, not overshadowed. But David's relaxed attitude and increasing detachment from the day-to-day grind of the office only deepened her frustrations. He would come into the office late, leave early, and sometimes take off entire afternoons to play golf with important clients. The more he drifted, the more the weight of the firm fell on Eleanor's shoulders. "You're doing it again," Eleanor snapped one afternoon after David had breezed in late from lunch with a smile on his face, as though time was his to command. She was sitting at her desk, papers stacked high around her, exhaustion etched into her face. Doing what David asked, his smile faltering slightly, but his tone still light. He had heard this before. "Leaving me to deal with everything," Eleanor replied, her voice tight. "You think I don't notice how you keep disappearing while I'm here picking up the slack?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Come on, Eleanor, it's not like that. I trust you. You're the one who's always got it under control. You don't need me micromanaging everything, right?" Eleanor's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and hurt. "This isn't about needing you to micromanage," she said quietly but firmly. "It's about respect. About acknowledging that we're supposed to be a team." But David didn't seem to take her seriously. He flashed her a grin, the same grin that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before. "Relax, Elle. It's fine. We've got this." It wasn't fine. As much as Eleanor tried to bury her frustrations, they continued to simmer just beneath the surface. She began to notice things she had previously overlooked: David's growing disinterest, his late-night texts with people she didn't recognize, and his tendency to smooth over issues with charm rather than effort. Every small slight began to feel like an insult, and it was all made worse by the arrival of a new associate. Sarah Lopez had joined Harrison Watts fresh out of law school in early September. Bright, enthusiastic, and eager to prove herself, Sarah was immediately drawn to David's charisma. It didn't take long before the two of them were working closely together, handling cases that Eleanor had expected to be a part of. David seemed to take Sarah under his wing, and soon enough, their names were being spoken together in the halls of the firm. At first, Eleanor told herself that Sarah was just another young attorney looking for mentorship, but it became harder to ignore the subtle ways in which David and Sarah's relationship began to shift the dynamics in the office. Sarah had an energy and confidence that reminded Eleanor of herself a decade ago, and it stung to see David so effortlessly drawn to the younger woman. Eleanor started to feel like an outsider in her own firm, the walls closing in as Sarah and David became more and more inseparable. One afternoon, Eleanor walked past David's office and saw the two of them huddled over a stack of files, laughing together. The sound of their laughter was like a knife twisting in her gut. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, her hands clenched at her sides. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked brightly, noticing Eleanor in the doorway. Eleanor forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Fine, just checking in." But it wasn't fine. That evening, as Eleanor sat alone in her apartment, the weight of everything pressed down on her: years of hard work, countless sacrifices, and the feeling that she was being pushed aside for someone newer, younger, and more carefree. The sense of betrayal festered, gnawing at her until it became a constant presence in her mind. As the weeks dragged on, Eleanor found herself growing more isolated. She began to pull away from David, though he didn't seem to notice. Her bitterness deepened, and she started avoiding social events at the firm, preferring to stay late at the office, working alone. On the rare occasions when she and David did speak, the conversations were strained, filled with unspoken tension that neither of them was willing to address. The final breaking point came in mid-December, when Harrison Watts landed a high-profile case that could elevate the firm's status in the region. Eleanor had been eyeing the case for months, preparing herself to take the lead and show everyone that she was more than capable of handling the spotlight. But at the last minute, David stepped in and took charge, bringing Sarah along as his second chair. Eleanor's fury was palpable. She stormed into David's office the day before the trial, her face flushed with anger. "I've been working on this case for weeks," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You had no right to take it from me." David leaned back in his chair, looking genuinely puzzled. "Eleanor, it's not personal. I thought you'd want to handle the research side while Sarah and I—" "Sarah and you," Eleanor interrupted, her voice rising. "This was supposed to be my case, David. You can't just waltz in and take credit for everything I've done." David frowned, clearly not expecting the intensity of her reaction. "I didn't mean to undermine you. I just thought—" "You didn't think," Eleanor snapped, cutting him off again. "You never think about how your decisions affect the rest of us." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the weight of Eleanor's words hanging in the air. David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Eleanor turned and stormed out of his office, leaving him staring after her in stunned silence. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment, replaying the conversation in her mind. The sense of betrayal, anger, and jealousy swirled together into a dark storm inside her, and for the first time she began to seriously consider that maybe, just maybe, David wasn't worth her loyalty anymore. And as that thought settled in, a dangerous idea began to take shape. In September of 1997, a wave of fresh energy swept through Harrison Watts when Sarah Lopez, a 26-year-old recent law school graduate, joined the firm. Eager to carve out her place in the competitive world of legal practice, Sarah arrived with a mixture of youthful enthusiasm and a keen desire to prove herself. Her arrival was like a burst of sunshine in the otherwise predictable atmosphere of the firm, bringing with it a sense of renewal and promise. Sarah was a stark contrast to Eleanor Mitchell, whose meticulous nature and reserved demeanor had long characterized the firm's work environment. Eleanor, now 34, had spent years building her career with a fierce dedication that had earned her the role of a linchpin at Harrison Watts. Yet, as Sarah began to make her mark, Eleanor couldn't ignore the growing dissonance between her own carefully cultivated world and the bright, unpredictable energy that Sarah brought with her. From the moment Sarah stepped into the firm, David Carter seemed drawn to her like a moth to a flame. David, with his natural charisma and easygoing demeanor, was always well-liked, but Sarah's spirited approach and unwavering optimism made her a natural fit with him. The two began collaborating on cases almost immediately, their partnership quickly becoming the talk of the office. The office, which had once been a place of subdued productivity, now buzzed with Sarah's infectious excitement and David's relaxed charm. Eleanor, who had once shared a close professional rapport with David, found herself increasingly sidelined. The camaraderie between David and Sarah was palpable. They often lingered in the hallways, their laughter echoing through the firm's corridors as they discussed legal strategies and the latest office gossip. Eleanor observed from a distance, her initial sense of intrigue gradually giving way to a gnawing discomfort. It was as if a new, unwelcome dynamic had settled into the firm, one that threatened to upend the balance she had fought so hard to maintain. David, seemingly oblivious to the shifting undercurrents, would often mention Sarah in conversations with Eleanor. "Sarah's got that spark you had when you started out," he'd remark with an easy smile. "She's passionate and full of ideas. Maybe you could take her under your wing." But Eleanor didn't see Sarah as just another eager junior attorney. She saw a rival, someone who was not only challenging her professional standing but also encroaching upon her personal space. Sarah's presence seemed to siphon off the attention and validation that Eleanor had always taken for granted. It felt as though David, who had once confided in Eleanor and relied on her steady judgment, was now shifting his focus to the new and exciting dynamo that was Sarah. The realization that David was turning to Sarah instead of her stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. She had always prided herself on being the firm's unsung hero, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. But with Sarah's arrival, she felt that her contributions were being overshadowed and her place in David's inner circle diminishing. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting that had ended with David and Sarah departing together for drinks with clients, Eleanor found herself unable to hold back her frustration any longer. She waited for David to return to the office, her nerves taut with the strain of unspoken grievances. When David finally walked in, his face flushed with the easy satisfaction of a successful evening, Eleanor confronted him. "David," she began, her voice betraying a tight edge of irritation, "I need to talk to you about you and Sarah." David looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What about us?" "You're spending an awful lot of time with her," Eleanor continued, her voice quivering slightly. "It's like she's become the center of your attention." David chuckled, an expression of genuine amusement crossing his face. "Come on, Eleanor. You're not jealous, are you? Sarah's new and needs some guidance. It's only natural that I'd spend more time with her." "Guidance?" Eleanor's voice trembled with barely contained anger. "You're hardly ever around for the firm anymore. And now you're focusing all your energy on her. Everything else is slipping through the cracks." David's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you're overreacting. This isn't about Sarah, it's about bringing in fresh perspectives." But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that David's reassurances were empty. To her, Sarah wasn't just a new face, she was a formidable rival. The sense of displacement Eleanor felt was not just a professional setback but a personal affront. The subtle shift in dynamics where David's attention had moved away from her and towards Sarah was the final straw. As Eleanor watched David's retreating figure, a seed of discontent took root. Her jealousy and frustration, previously simmering under the surface, now boiled over into a more dangerous emotion. It wasn't just about losing a professional edge, it was about losing something far more personal, her place in David's world. Sarah's presence, initially a source of professional motivation, had become a bitter reminder of Eleanor's growing isolation. It was as if Sarah's bright, optimistic energy was eroding the very foundation upon which Eleanor had built her career. The growing rift between Eleanor and David began to take on a life of its own, feeding Eleanor's discontent and shaping her thoughts into something darker. Every interaction between David and Sarah, every shared laugh and exchanged glance, felt like a direct challenge to Eleanor's place in both the firm and David's personal sphere. The more David and Sarah grew close, the more Eleanor felt herself slipping away, both professionally and emotionally. The realization that David was slipping from her grasp was a heavy blow, one that Eleanor was not prepared to accept without consequence. Eleanor's once straightforward professional world had become a battleground where every smile, every shared joke between David and Sarah was a reminder of her own diminishing influence. The more she watched them, the more her sense of betrayal deepened. Sarah's arrival had disrupted not just the office's dynamics but Eleanor's carefully maintained sense of control. And as the days passed, Eleanor's resentment grew into a dangerous obsession, one that threatened to unravel everything she had worked so hard to achieve. As the months of 1997 ticked by, Eleanor Mitchell's simmering jealousy transformed into a consuming darkness. What had begun as professional envy gradually morphed into an obsessive scrutiny, her once pragmatic focus now distorted by suspicion and resentment. Eleanor's days were spent meticulously observing David Carter and Sarah Lopez, scrutinizing their every interaction for signs of betrayal. Conversations that once seemed innocuous now felt laden with hidden meanings, and fleeting glances that passed between them seemed to tell a story of deceit that Eleanor was convinced was unfolding right before her eyes. Eleanor's mounting distrust was fueled by a series of unsettling observations. She noted how David and Sarah would often huddle in corners of the office, their voices lowered but their laughter audible. Their close working relationship, once a simple professional arrangement, now seemed to cross into more personal territory. Eleanor was unable to shake the feeling that their connection had grown beyond mere camaraderie. Even though she had no tangible evidence to support her suspicions, the mere thought that David might be developing a personal interest in Sarah, someone so new and unseasoned, felt like a deep personal betrayal. Sarah, on the other hand, began to sense the shift in Eleanor's demeanor. The warmth that had once been a hallmark of their interactions had turned cold and distant. Sarah couldn't quite pinpoint the reason for Eleanor's change in attitude, but she felt it keenly. One evening, as Sarah sat in David's office, the soft hum of the computer providing the only background noise, she voiced her concern. "David, is there something going on with Eleanor? She's been acting so distant lately. Have I done something to offend her?" David looked up from his papers, the faint glow of the computer screen casting a shadow on his face. "That's just Eleanor," he said with a shrug, his tone casual. "She's always been intense. It's probably nothing. Don't let it bother you." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced by David's dismissal. She had noticed the tension and couldn't ignore the growing unease that seemed to permeate the office atmosphere. The once harmonious environment between Eleanor and David had shifted, replaced by a palpable strain that seemed to seep into every interaction. Sarah tried to brush off the discomfort, but it lingered, gnawing at her confidence. The tipping point came in early December. Eleanor had dedicated herself to a significant case for months, pouring her heart into every detail. The case was her chance to prove herself, a testament to her hard work and dedication. She had envisioned taking the lead in the courtroom, showcasing her expertise and earning the recognition she felt she deserved. But in a move that felt like a gut punch, David announced at the last minute that he would be handling the courtroom presentation. To Eleanor's horror, he had brought Sarah in as his second, sidelining her completely. The case, which Eleanor had hoped would be her triumph, ended up being a showcase for David and Sarah's combined efforts. Their victory in the courtroom was celebrated, but the credit seemed to bypass Eleanor entirely, going straight to the dynamic duo of David and Sarah. Eleanor's anger was a storm, raging inside her as she confronted David in the empty office late that evening. "That was my case," she spat, her eyes flashing with dark fury. "You took it from me and handed it over to Sarah." David's reaction was one of surprise and confusion. He waved off her accusations with a casual dismissiveness that only served to deepen Eleanor's frustration. "It was a team effort, Eleanor. You know how these things work. Don't take everything so personally." But Eleanor couldn't take it any other way. To her, this wasn't just a case, it was a symbol of her worth, of her place in the firm. The fact that David had so effortlessly displaced her in favor of Sarah felt like a direct assault on her professional identity. The perceived slight was more than she could bear. That night, Eleanor returned to her apartment, her mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and injustice. She sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the silence amplifying her inner turmoil. The weight of the evening's events, combined with the relentless feeling of being pushed aside, crystallized into a firm resolve. Eleanor knew she couldn't continue down this path of helpless frustration. She made a decision that night, one that was driven by a mix of desperation and anger. Sarah's presence at Harrison Watts, which had once been a source of professional challenge, had now become a symbol of everything Eleanor felt was being stolen from her. David's disregard for her contributions, his apparent preference for Sarah, was a final betrayal she couldn't ignore. Eleanor's plan began to take shape in the shadowed corners of her mind. It was a plan born from her deep-seated need to reclaim her position and to remind David of the value she had always brought to the firm. It was not a plan of overt hostility, but of calculated, subtle actions that would shift the dynamics in her favor. As the weeks progressed, Eleanor began to implement her strategy. She started to gather evidence of David and Sarah's interactions, documenting every meeting, every conversation that seemed to hint at something more than professional interest. Her observations became increasingly detailed, her notes meticulously organized. Eleanor was determined to find anything that could support her suspicions and serve as a basis for her actions. The tension in the office continued to build, with Eleanor's increasingly erratic behavior adding to the strain. Her interactions with Sarah became frosty, marked by an underlying hostility that Sarah struggled to understand. Eleanor's once reliable presence was now tinged with a sense of detached calculation. David, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious to the growing storm. His focus was on the cases and the firm's upcoming projects, and he continued to believe that Eleanor's behavior was simply a result of her natural intensity. He couldn't see the storm brewing beneath the surface, nor could he understand the depth of Eleanor's feelings of betrayal. Eleanor's decision to confront Sarah directly was imminent. She had reached a breaking point, and the need to address the situation in a way that would put her back in control became paramount. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only reveal the depth of Eleanor's grievances, but also set in motion events that would forever alter the dynamics at Harrison Watts. On a frigid January evening in 1998, the culmination of months of tension and unresolved conflict reached a harrowing climax. The firm of Harrison Watts had just celebrated another significant victory in the courtroom, the clinking of champagne glasses and the hum of congratulatory chatter still resonating faintly through the empty office. As the celebration waned, the office, usually bustling with energy, was now eerily quiet, save for the three people who remained behind David Carter, Sarah Lopez, and Eleanor Mitchell. Eleanor, whose earlier revelry had long since turned into a haze of intoxication and seething rage, felt the simmering anger she had harbored for months begin to boil over. The victory party had been a stark reminder of the exclusion she had felt. David and Sarah's triumphs had always come at her expense. The alcohol had only intensified her feelings, eroding the last vestiges of her restraint. Her steps were unsteady as she made her way through the empty corridors, her mind clouded with a singular, dark focus. She found David in his office, sitting behind his desk, his demeanor relaxed and jovial as he wrapped up the final tasks of the day. The sight of him so calm, so untroubled was like a match to her smoldering fury. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts, her eyes flashing with an emotion that went beyond mere anger. "I gave everything to this firm. To you," she seethed, her voice a strained whisper that cut through the silence of the room. Her gaze was intense, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. David, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, stood up from his chair, his confusion evident. "Eleanor, what are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she shouted, her voice rising in a mixture of frustration and hurt. "You've been pushing me aside for months, all for her." Sarah, who had been walking past David's office on her way out, stopped abruptly at the commotion. She peered in, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. "What's going on?" "Stay out of this," Eleanor snapped, her eyes locking onto Sarah with a fierce intensity that brooked no argument. David moved to intercede, placing himself between Eleanor and Sarah. "Eleanor, calm down. This isn't the place for this." But Eleanor was far beyond the point of calm. The years of feeling overshadowed, of being dismissed and disregarded, coalesced into a single, blinding fury. Without warning, she reached for a letter opener from David's desk, her movements jerky and frantic, the handle cold against her trembling fingers. "Do you think I'm just going to let you take everything from me?" she screamed, her voice breaking with raw emotion. The words were almost incoherent, driven more by her psychological disintegration than by any coherent argument. "Eleanor, stop!" David shouted, his voice laced with both urgency and fear as he moved toward her in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. But the moment had already spiraled beyond control. In a horrifying flash of uncontrolled rage, Eleanor advanced toward Sarah, the letter opener poised like a weapon of doom. David lunged to intercept, his movements a blur of frantic energy. The struggle that ensued was chaotic and desperate, the sound of David's panicked shouts mingling with Sarah's horrified screams. The scene was a grotesque tableau of betrayal and violence. In the chaos, Eleanor's grip on the letter opener faltered only to tighten again with renewed resolve. The blade found its mark, plunging into David's side with a sickening thud. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief, a look of profound betrayal etched onto his face. The life seemed to drain from him as he collapsed onto the floor, the crimson pool spreading out beneath him in a grim testament to the violent clash. Sarah stood frozen in horror, her scream piercing the silence as she watched the scene unfold. The office, once a space of professional ambition and camaraderie, was now a nightmarish crime scene. The moments that followed were a blur of frantic movements and raw, gut-wrenching emotion. David lay on the floor, his breathing shallow and erratic, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. Eleanor stood over him, her hands shaking uncontrollably, the reality of her actions beginning to sink in with agonizing clarity. The letter opener fell from her grasp, clattering onto the floor beside David's motionless body. By the time the police arrived, the office was a scene of utter devastation. David was pronounced dead at the scene, the life extinguished in a tragic act of violence that none could have foreseen. Eleanor, her face pale and her eyes hollow with shock, was arrested on the spot. The weight of her actions pressed down upon her, a crushing burden of regret and despair. The trial that followed was a spectacle of courtroom drama and emotional turmoil. Eleanor's defense claimed that the intense pressure, jealousy, and perceived betrayal had driven her to an irreversible breaking point. The courtroom became a battleground of legal arguments and emotional testimony, but the case was straightforward in its brutality. The jury found Eleanor guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah, shattered by the events, left Cedar Springs in the wake of the trial. The trauma of that night was too great to bear, and she sought a new beginning far from the town that had become synonymous with her darkest memories. The once promising young attorney vanished from the town's memory, leaving behind only whispers and the faint echo of her contributions. Eleanor's fall from grace was complete. The firm that had once been her entire world was now a distant memory, her career in ruins. Her life sentence was a grim reminder of how ambition, jealousy, and a fractured sense of betrayal could lead to unimaginable consequences. Cedar Springs would remember the night as a dark chapter in its history, a chilling testament to how quickly professional rivalry and personal vendettas could spiral into something far more tragic and irreversible.